We are just days away from Notre Dame going to camp in South Bend, the first full season for Marcus Freeman and staff. Welcome into the Voice of College Football as we break down the game we all love each and every day with you. And we are in the midst of a series of live streams previewing fall camp. We did Texas A&M a few days ago. We've got Clemson and Notre Dame and LSU scheduled this week. And here we go with the Fighting Irish on Monday. Got Nathan Urbach on the line from Golden Homers to break down the Irish. Nathan, what's going on?
It's going well, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I know we've done this a lot in the past. It's been a while, but happy to be back on the airwaves and getting things going before the season starts.
For sure. So we've got just under 5 weeks until week 1 in Columbus. So Notre Dame is certainly not unaccustomed to opening the season with a big splash in a big game, but they don't come too much bigger than this one for a non-conference game for, a team in a conference, and for Notre Dame to drive a stake for the season to say, hey, we're going to be a contender. So I guess we'll start with that. Do you prefer this type of entry into the season, or would you rather break in against somebody else before you have to take on somebody of this caliber?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a couple ways to see it. If you win that game, especially it being on the road for Notre Dame this season, it sets them up for, a potential college playoff berth. Their next best game is probably Clemson at home. They do go to USC this year as well, like usual, USC at home or away, with them being better probably being better with Lincoln Riley and the guys that they have brought in. So certainly a tough schedule, but you start off the year with a win at Ohio State. You're kind of in the driver's seat of being a college football, in the college football playoff. So you have that aspect of it. But then certainly the other aspect is, you maybe like to get a few games under your belt, especially with a new quarterback, albeit a talented one in my opinion. But obviously, it would be fun if it was maybe not his first game as a starter. So it's kind of, you can kind of take it both ways. So I think this year I would lean more on the side of if Ohio State was the third or fourth game of the season, that would probably, maybe bode well in Notre Dame's favor. But certainly excited nonetheless.
Guy David here is saying, forgive the Big Ten, forgive Michigan. Sorry about fielding Yo's. Come to the Big Ten, please. We will add Stanford too. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know. I was actually just speaking with a buddy about this the other day, and who knows really what Notre Dame's going to do when it comes to the Big Ten. But I wouldn't be surprised if Stanford ends up there. I wouldn't be surprised if Oregon ends up there. There's probably certainly some other teams that could, quote unquote, pair with Notre Dame if that was the case. But I think, like you mentioned, you tweeted the other day, like Big Ten's not going to go an even number of teams simply because they have to have an even number of teams. They're going to get the best quality they can. And if that's simply just Notre Dame or whoever it may be, then I think that's the route they're going to take.
So Nathan, for you and for anybody else that knows Notre Dame football and what the mindset and the approach may be, they obviously just didn't jump on the Big Ten's request and join the league. They're contemplating it. They haven't turned them down from what we know yet. So what factors do you think are being taken into consideration? Do you think that they're looking for another TV contract, and that might be the deciding factor?
Yeah, they still have, I think, 2 years left with NBC before it's either at the end of 2024 or the end of 2025. I forget exactly. So they have a couple more years with that. Obviously, they could be bought out of that, or if anything, if they need to be. But I think they're working with NBC to see if maybe they can get some more money there. I think that's maybe the biggest common misconception with Notre Dame is that they make more money as being independent than being in a conference, especially now. So I think they're certainly going to weigh that aspect of getting those conference television rights. So NBC is obviously someone, you hear the rumors of maybe a streaming service like HBO or Netflix, maybe taking them on down the road as well, which would certainly be intriguing, I think, for Notre Dame to be on one of those platforms if it worked out that way. But I don't know. I don't know where I lean at this point with them. I think there's a decent chance they end up in the Big Ten or, some sort of ACC deal or whatever it may be. But I think in a perfect world, they'd love to stay independent.
So you don't know which way you lean in terms of the way it's going to play out, but which way do you lean in terms of what you want?
I tend to, I think, lean the way Notre Dame wants to lean in this aspect, which would be to stay independent. I think they have a big enough brand, obviously, which has been showcased, for many, many years now. And as long as I think they get that money, that makes sense. I think it would be probably in their best interest to stay independent. But I don't know. There is an intriguing aspect of moving, specifically, I think, to the Big Ten. Now with USC there, their biggest rival, in my opinion, certainly their most longstanding rival. I would say that's intriguing because they would still play them on a yearly basis or not have to worry about playing them on a yearly basis because it would be there. You can reunite with the Michigan State, Purdue rivalries that have been showcased for a long period of time. Would love to play Ohio State on at least I don't know if it'd be yearly per se, but at least regularly. And then of course all of the other Midwest programs that are involved with that conference. Maybe not Midwest per se, but Penn State is certainly a team that they have some history with that I'd love to play on a regular basis. I loved the Wisconsin game last year, and they're going to be playing them again here. I think either next year or the year after that. With the COVID shutdown, they kind of rearranged some things on the schedule. So a lot of the Big Ten teams are certainly programs that I would like Notre Dame to play on a more regular basis. You have the Northwestern aspect of it too, with it being the Chicago high academic, and stuff like that as well. So if they do end up joining a conference, I definitely lean towards the Big Ten, and I think most Notre Dame fans do. But I certainly lean towards staying independent if it's doable.
Talking of Notre Dame football here for the next hour, we've got Nathan Urbach on the line from Golden Homers Podcast. Please check it out. We'll pull up his banner right here. You can follow him on Twitter at Nathan_Urbach, and that's ERBACH, Golden Homers Podcast. Have you released anything recently?
No, so that's what I was going to say. Part of the reason of me saying back on the airwaves is myself and my co-host Mason Plummer. Our schedules haven't really aligned. We both have had some different work opportunities arise over the last several months. So we are actually probably going to be recording tonight for the first time in a few months.
Okay.
And excited to kind of get back on that and do that hopefully weekly throughout the season, if not at bare minimum bi-weekly, but even maybe more. So we're back here soon, and we'll be back to stay hopefully.
There you go, folks. You can get a fresh slice of Golden Homers Podcast here in the next couple of days. Just again, keep it locked on Nathan's Twitter, or they can just go to what audio platforms and just subscribe there.
Yeah, absolutely. We're on every major podcast platform you can find. So.
All right, we will turn from realignment and expansion talk to what's going on here in 22. So it starts with the quarterback. You addressed the advantages that would have been in play to give Tyler Buchner some work against some lesser opponents before he's got to go to Columbus. But at the same time, he has been on the field in meaningful minutes, meaningful snaps against good teams. So he's not a complete first time starter technically, but again, from the standpoint of having reps. So what does a good season out of Tyler Buchner look like?
Well, there's certainly the running ability out of him as well. So I don't think you need to have these elite passing numbers for him to have a solid season. But I think anywhere, where he's not – last year you could kind of see some turnover issues maybe arising, that he's a little raw with him missing his senior year of high school due to COVID. He also missed his sophomore year of high school due to a torn ACL. So he really only had that 1 year, junior year, which was one of the best years in California state history for statistics, at least. So if he can take care of the football, I would say maybe rush for 500-600 yards. I think he's certainly capable of that, maybe even more, and rushing for double-digit touchdowns. I think that's very possible. And then just, he has a big arm, so big plays from his arm, keeping the defense honest, and throwing for, 2,000 or so yards with, again, light turnovers and, a decent amount of touchdowns. I would say for a first season out of him, that would be something that most people should be pretty happy with.
Okay, we're just going to go by position here to a certain extent. And folks, leave your comments and questions in the live chat, and we'll pick them off and send them Nathan's way on Notre Dame football. All right. Kyron Williams is gone. Running back situation. Chris Tyree obviously can fly. What's the running back room look like?
Yeah, I mean, if you would ask me a few months ago, I would have said they're actually in a pretty good spot. Certainly, Kyron Williams is a big loss, and he was one of the better running backs in college football, and definitely a leader for Notre Dame. But Logan Diggs, as a freshman last year, played really well. He's actually coming off an off-season shoulder injury, but he should be. I don't know if he's going to be back ready for Ohio State, but should be back sometime in September. So for the majority of the season, that's good. Chris Tyree, obviously, I think needs to take that step as a major running back, like you mentioned. He has the 4.3 speed. He is a little slight in stature, so hopefully he can break some more tackles or get some running room. Offensive line play, I mean, I know we'll get to that here soon, but it's going to be better this year, so that will certainly help. Audric Estime is a sophomore or a redshirt freshman, I should say. They got a little bit of playing time last year in garbage time. Later on in the year, big running back, kind of built more like the ones that you would see at Alabama or Georgia. I'm not saying he's at that caliber, but certainly has the look of one. And then the unfortunate thing is they did have a pretty big time kid in Jadarian Price coming in as a freshman. He tore his Achilles, if I'm not mistaken, about a month ago, and he's going to miss the entire season. So right now they're kind of down to 3 guys without Logan Diggs probably ready for game 1. So they have another freshman in Jabron Payne, who they stole from, I believe, Cincinnati late in the process this past year. Actually, after signing day, I think he was already committed and signed to Cincinnati and ended up, Indiana. It was Indiana. I apologize. He came over with Dylan McCullough when he ended up coming to Notre Dame from Indiana as the new running backs coach. So you have those 3 to start the year, and you're hoping that you can kind of abide by those 3 until Logan Diggs comes back. So I do think Logan Diggs is going to be a pretty big part of the puzzle there.
Okay, so the offensive line is going to be better. Why?
Well, certainly the tackle spots. You had 2 guys that started late in the season for him last year, or at least halfway through. Blake Fisher got hurt game 1 against FSU, came back for the playoff game and played well. He was a 5-star kid coming out of high school, looks the part. Honestly, I think he's probably going to be a first-round pick down the road. And he is actually most likely going to start out at right tackle this season because Joe Alt, who is another really talented freshman that they brought in, played about half the season for him last year. He's back starting at left tackle. You have Jarrett Patterson back this year. He's actually probably going to move to guard. He's been at a center for Notre Dame for the last 3 or 4 seasons. Zeke Correll, who's been in the program for a while now, just a naturally better center than he is a guard. They tried him at guard last year. It didn't really work out too well. But I'm sure people on here recognize it, but he played the season before that at center when they had some injuries. Played really well against actually Alabama and a couple other good teams later on in the season. And then Josh Lugg, who's a 6th-year senior, is back. And so they just have a veteran offensive line group mixed with very, very talented young guys. And I think there's just going to be a little bit more cohesion there. And certainly some better talent. And then obviously, I mean, you bring back Harry Hiestand, who's one of the better offensive line coaches in recent memory. He left Notre Dame, went to the Chicago Bears for a few years, and then was sort of sitting out last year. And now he's back at Notre Dame under Marcus Freeman. And I think he's just a really, really good match at Notre Dame. And, I think you can certainly count on the offensive line being better simply only because he's back.
Nathan Erbach breaking down Notre Dame football for us. We go a complete hour here on the Voice of College Football, so please bring your comments and questions there. We'll pass them on to Nathan. You can catch his podcast, Golden Homers Podcast. Got a new upload coming, most likely here in the next 2 or 3 days. So track it on the major audio platforms and also on Nathan's Twitter account that you see there on the screen. Kevin Austin takes off to the NFL. Is he the only major wide receiver loss? He's the only one that I can come up with.
Yeah, certainly the only major one. I mean, they pretty much have everybody coming back besides him. Lorenzo Styles, who was a freshman last year, really good. He should be their main weapon at wide receiver this year, at least in my opinion. You do have some, I think the biggest issue there is just slight in numbers. You have Avery Davis coming back off an ACL injury last year towards the end of the season. He should be ready to go for Ohio State. Joe Wilkins, another guy that's back, but got hurt in the offseason. I'm not sure he'll be back for Ohio State, but hopefully he's back at some point during the season. Tobias Merriweather is a guy to look at as a incoming freshman. He's actually their only incoming freshman at wide receiver, but a really talented guy. I think he's going to get some play there. And then Deion Colsey, Jaden Thomas are a few other guys to keep in mind at wide receiver. But so I think, Braden Lindsey, who's been in the program for a while. So there's certainly some talent, maybe some guys that haven't lived up to what they're supposed to be. But some guys that have been in the program for a while, and then a few guys that, are looking for that first start who were talented recruits as well. So pretty much the biggest issue there is some depth. If they have some injuries, then they could get kind of ugly.
Before we switch to defense, out of all these playoff proposals that are out there, and we saw generally 12-team playoff proposals being delivered out there in public that were actual playoff proposals that the SEC certainly wanted to see go through. So out of any reasonable playoff format that could take hold probably in 2026, are there any playoff proposals that would favor Notre Dame more so than others?
You know what? I haven't. Outside of, I know that there was the one before all of this, more realignment talk that happened where essentially Notre Dame was going to give up a spot as a top 4 team. And, that didn't bother me too much because it essentially meant that they were going to host a home game in late November. And I'm okay with that. But I don't, obviously if they were to join a conference, I think it would be, they would have as much favorability as anybody, but I don't know. That's a good question. Mark, I haven't thought too much about it. I still kind of, Notre Dame's a big brand. If they lose one game or go undefeated, I think that there's a good chance on a yearly basis they're going to make the college football playoff or be right in the mix. So like last year, they barely missed out after losing one game to Cincinnati at home. But it's hard to argue when they go undefeated or they lose one game. And I think this year specifically, if they lose one game, that means they beat either Ohio State or Clemson, and then that means they also beat USC, or at least 2 out of those 3. And I think that's probably going to be a pretty big resume booster. So in terms of formats, I haven't thought too much about it, at least over the last few months. But those are kind of my thoughts overall. Is they win, they lose one or none, they're going to be in or very close to it.
Well, like you say, I can't imagine that Notre Dame, in terms of their decision to join a conference, is going to weigh heavily on the playoff format. That's not going to be their driving force because there's so much more weighty issues into the determination to stay independent versus joining a league, as opposed to just a slight advantage or disadvantage in the playoff format or structure. But at the same time, it is to be considered that they could be entering a new playoff era with an automatic first round game every time they would make the playoff, as opposed to a conference champion getting a bye. Before we get to the defense, I'm going to read off these Phil Steele division or individual unit rankings on offense and see what you think of Notre Dame's standing. So in the quarterback room, he's got Notre Dame at 39.
No, this is 39 out of all the teams.
39th in the country in quarterback play. This is the entire quarterback unit.
Sure. I think that's fair right now. Tyler Buckner, like you mentioned, last year he did get some play as a freshman, but overall it wasn't like he had a whole lot of time. He is talented, and he's a guy that can make that quarterback room jump up, very quickly if he has a good season. But Drew Pine is another guy that doesn't have much playing time under his belt. I think he has some limited ability there. I think he's a guy that can come in a pinch and do fairly well. But overall, there's some just limited athleticism, limited arm strength, and different things like that. And then Steven Angeli, the other quarterback in that room, is a true freshman. He was a lower level 5-star with some decent offers, and I'm fairly high on him overall. But again, a true freshman who I think probably in a perfect world needs a year or two under his belt before he plays. So I think it's hard to argue with them being 39th. And honestly, I think being top 40 is still kind of a testament to how good Tyler Buckner is, or how people think he can be down the road.
Running back 50.
That one, when healthy, I would disagree with. I think, forgive me, who did you say wrote this?
Phil Steele.
Phil Steele. I do think that there is some recruiting ranking bias when it comes to some of these things. Notre Dame does have a fairly young running back room, but Chris Tyree was a top 60-ish prospect when he came out. Hasn't really had the opportunity to be a star, but we know what he can do when the ball's in his hands. Logan Diggs was a tremendous freshman last year, and he was a 3-star recruit, but he played well as a freshman. So you can kind of just knock out the recruiting ranking out the window, I think, in that. And then you have a guy like Audric Estime, who was also a 4-star guy freshman last year. Jabron Payne, 4-star, who's coming in, and then Jadarian Price, who was a 4-star, again, out for the year. So maybe that plays a role in his ranking. But I think it's a really, really good 5-man unit when fully healthy. But maybe hard to argue with them only having 3 healthy guys right now.
Then with the tight end position included at receiver, Notre Dame at 11.
I think when you include the tight end, I think it has to be there. Michael Mayer is just a stud. He's going to be a first-round pick, probably the top tight end in the country, at least from a draft-eligible standpoint. I know Brock Bowers has probably something to say about that over at Georgia. Certainly different players, too. I think Bowers is maybe more of a receiving threat just in general, kind of a wide receiver playing tight end. And Michael Mayer is more of your traditional tight end, that can also play wide receiver and line up outside. But they also have a really talented deep tight end room. You have a guy coming in, and can't think right now. They have a stud kid coming in who tore his ACL actually as a senior, and he's probably going to get some play at wide receiver this year just because they need bodies there. And they have 5 or 6 other guys at tight end that have played or will be playing this year. So when you include the tight end room, in the discussion, it's hard to argue with that. And then again, I think I go back to my comments earlier with the wide receiver room. As long as they stay healthy, they have a pretty talented wide receiver room. It's more so if they lose a few guys, then it can get kind of sketchy from here on out.
Are we talking about Tobias Merriweather? Tobias
Merriweather is actually a true freshman wide receiver. I'm pulling it up right now. I'm kind of at a blank. It's been a while since I've been on the airwaves, like I said. So, just a little.
Oh, we don't expect you to know everything, Nathan. 99% of it, so we're good with that. I was just trying to figure out who you were talking about. That
Eli Raridan.
Okay.
He was he's a top 100 kid on pretty much consensus in the tight end room. So, I think he's a kid that specifically, if you follow Notre Dame, then you're very excited about him even as a freshman.
Phil Steele with the offensive line at number 9 in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I said, and I think maybe there's a little bit of bias when it comes to the recruiting rankings there, because I do think that they still kind of need to prove that. But I think all the talent in the world is there at offensive line to go from a unit that was very poor to start out last year. Towards the end of the season, they got much better. And I think this year they have the potential to be right back on track of what we're used to seeing for Notre Dame offensive lines. So I think 9 you could argue is maybe high right now, but I think at the end of the season, you could argue it was way too low.
Before we get to the defense here, we got Daniel Wade with the super chat. Appreciate that so much. Thanks for what you both do. Go Irish. Thanks, Daniel. And hey, we might as well pick off a question that leads to where we're headed eventually anyway. So, Nathan, thoughts on our kicking game? We do not have a returning place kicker or punter.
Yeah, no, that's, I don't think Notre Dame fans really know much or know what to expect out of the kicking game. They got 2 transfers in the portal at both punter and kicker. Blake Grupe, who was at Arkansas State, had a decent career there, but, we're talking about Arkansas State versus Power 5. So you got to see what he's going to do. If he goes 3 for 3 against Ohio State with a couple kicks over 40, then obviously we're probably looking a little bit better. If he goes 1 for 3 and he misses something from, 30 out, then, we're you might be you might be a little nervous. They do have a talented kid in Joshua Bryan who maybe gets a look as well, who was a kid they brought in as a recruit. Punter, I'm not as worried about. They brought in a really talented freshman in Bryce McPherson, and they also landed a kid. I believe he was out of Harvard, if I'm not mistaken, and his name's John Sott. So punter, not as worried about, but we all know how kicking can be, especially in college football. You miss a few kicks here and there, which it seems like every team does on a yearly basis, and all of a sudden it's a different ball game. So we'll see. But Notre Dame has had some good kicking and has had, the past, I think almost a decade now. They haven't had to worry too much about the kicking game, and hopefully they won't have to do that this year as well.
So looking at the defense, Nathan, we'll start up front with what expects to be a top defensive front. Phil Steele's got him at number 6. There's a couple studs up there that should factor heavily in next year's NFL draft. So defensive line looks sharp.
Yeah, I think going into the season, this is the clear top unit from a previous production standpoint and what we're expecting this year. Isaiah Foskey is, one of the best defensive ends in the country. You have the Adam Alola twins back in Jason and Justin, who, Jason is one of the better interior guys in the country. And then Justin is a really just solid, kind of rotation piece on the defensive line. Riley Mills is a guy I'm really high on who should factor in at 3 tech and on the strong side defensive end. A couple good freshmen. I'm not sure 100% if they're going to be, guys that factor in this year, but Aiden Gobaira was my favorite kid coming in the 2022 class. I think he needs to put a little weight on before he's a guy that they, really count on. But yeah, they're very deep in both interior and on the edge. And when I say deep, I don't mean just with bodies. They have some talent. Brought in another kid. They had an injury to one of their better depth pieces who, he's not going to be out for the entire year, but probably, or he could be out for the year. I shouldn't say that. There's a possibility he's out for the year, but hopefully back towards the middle to end of the season. And they brought in another depth piece on the defensive line that I think will help. And yeah, no, it's filled with depth. It's filled with talent, top tier talent, and then even some of the other guys that are maybe not on that top tier. They're just really solid college football players. So that should be a unit that, unless injuries just strike them like crazy, it should be top tier the entire season.
Same thing with the linebackers. Steele has them at number 10 in the country.
Yeah, the thing with linebacker, there might be the top tier talent might not be there. You return guys like JD Bertrand, and you get Maris Leofau back, who I think's actually could be in that top tier talent, but he missed all of last season after expected to be, a big name for them. Jack Kaiser's back. You have Bo Bauer back, so there might not be that quote unquote first round or maybe even second round talent. Maybe Leofau can get to there, but just really steady college football players. And then you have a few young guys. They brought in a really, really nice freshman class. Maybe a few of those guys can get in the mix. You have Prince Colley, who was the Buckus Award winner 2 seasons ago in high school football, who hasn't, as a freshman, didn't really leave too much of a mark, but he's a kid that could mix in well. So again, a lot of depth, certainly, and we'll see if they have the top tier talent that maybe the Isaiah Foskeys of the world bring on the defensive line. But I don't think there's anything too much to worry about there.
Cam Hart, for the time that I watched Notre Dame play, which is 5 to 8 games a year, something in that range, is a guy that it didn't take long to determine before I knew what his reputation was supposed to be, that this guy can play. So he comes back. He could have gone to the NFL. So there's a big plus in the secondary, for a secondary that Phil Steele has in the top 5 in the country at number 5. And, of course, Brandon Joseph in from Northwestern for his first go around. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously you lose Kyle Hamilton, big deal there. One of the best players in the country last year until his injury. But I think at least at the college football level, replacing him with Brandon Joseph, you hopefully you don't see too much of a downfall there, at least at the safety position. So Brandon Joseph is there. I think you have a few guys that kind of took steps last year: Ramon Henderson, Xavier Watts, who moved over from wide receiver to the secondary last year. You have a couple guys that have been in the program forever, in Houston Griffith and DJ Brown. So a lot of depth at safety. Maybe, like, again, it's probably a tier down from even the linebackers from an overall NFL, standing talent wise. But guys like Ramon Henderson and Xavier Watts might be able to play into that. And then the biggest thing, I think, is corner. I mean, obviously Cam Hart, who's been a little banged up in camp, or in the spring, I should say. You hope that he can stay healthy all year and put another really solid season of film on there, because I agree with you completely. I think he's a guy that can really produce in the NFL from a talent standpoint. Clarence Lewis has had some rough times at times, I should say, and but I think that there's certainly some talent there. He started as a freshman, or played a decent amount as a freshman, which I think says a lot about his character and just his development as a player and maturity as a player. But last year he had some rough games. So you hope that he can kind of get things going. And, they have some other talented redshirt freshmen that, might be able to play a role. You're looking at a Jaden Mickey who can play in the slot. I think they're very, very excited about him. Tariq Bracy, who's been in the program for a while. They're excited about him in the slot as well. And then you have guys like Ryan Barnes and Philip Riley, who can hopefully take that next step as younger guys who have been in the program for now, almost 2 years. You hope that they can maybe take a leap for you and at least give you some quality depth there.
Okay, so August camp is going to be biggest for who? Any particular player, unit, anything that you want to hear about as you try to gather as much video and information as possible for the next 4 weeks that you want to hear about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to go back down to the QB and wide receiver play. Like I mentioned, there's some young guys at wide receiver that need to step up and play well for them. And there's some depth issues there, certainly. And then obviously you have a younger QB who's going to be making his first start, at Ohio State. So you want to see him, playing well first and foremost, but also maybe building some confidence with his receivers. That would be nice. And then I think certainly the last thing we talked about there was the secondary. You want to see good things out of Tariq Bracy, Clarence Lewis, Jaden Mickey as a freshman, because we know that wide receiver isn't an issue at Ohio State, and that is a mismatch currently right now that I think most Notre Dame fans should be very concerned about. And so if Ohio State's going to be able to throw the football all over Notre Dame simply because their corners are a weak spot, it might not matter if the trenches are better, because we know CJ Stroud's going to be able to get the ball out. We know that guys like, Jackson Smith and Jigba and Marvin Harrison Jr. and those types of players are going to be able to make plays on the outside. So certainly maybe Isaiah Foskey and Jason Adamalola and the Notre Dame offensive line can take over the game to an extent. But I think we've seen in college football over the last 5 to 7 years that when you have the skill position talent like Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, those kind of programs can produce. Sometimes it doesn't matter if the trenches are better these days, because those players are just going to elevate your program more so than what Notre Dame has been able to do over the last 5 to 7 years. And maybe that's why they haven't gotten over that hump.
Yeah, the formula seems to be that while you're not going to run it 50 times and throw it 5, the run heavy, keep Stroud on the sideline. But an offensive line that should be one of the best in the nation, and a defense that's loaded with talent but unproven for the most part, and didn't fare too well last year. And maybe you get a 250-yard rushing attack type of game and throw it 18 to 22 times effectively. And then on the flip side, as you mentioned, it's a lot to ask for those guys to get home consistently, because we're looking at elite versus elite defensive line for Notre Dame, offensive line for Ohio State, both 3 to 5 of the best at their positions in the country. So, but to play over their heads on the defensive front and overwhelm an elite offensive line and at least make it difficult for Stroud. So we've got our buddy Will, big Notre Dame fan, is excited to see Jalen Sneed and would like your thoughts on Sneed.
Yeah, he's one of those, young, talented linebackers that I mentioned earlier, that are coming in there. He's part of a really, really dynamic linebacker class in 2022. I'm not sure he's ready to contribute as a freshman. I think there's some weight gain there. I think he came in at like 6'1", 198, which, he has elite speed for that spot. So maybe there's, sort of a niche role that he can have, but with returning all the guys that they're returning. We saw last year, even with an injury to Maris Leofau, Prince Colley, who won the Buckus Award as the top linebacker in the entire country coming in, he barely saw the field. And I know it's kind of apples to oranges. You just never know how players are gonna, contribute year one, just, how they fare in fall camp, so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised if we saw him on the field too much, specifically early on. But no, very, very talented and a kid that I expect to be a very, really good player, during his career at Notre Dame.
To Michael Campbell's point here, says Ohio State has not put up the numbers on a defense ranked as high as Notre Dame. So, that's a reasonable comment to make. Ohio State, it's not like they put up 50 points against everybody last year. They certainly had, I wouldn't call them struggles, but yeah, they popped off for 59 against Purdue and 56 against Michigan State. Two teams that were really good, top 10 to 15 teams in the country. But still, other than that, 26 points against Nebraska, 33 against Penn State, and that was a defensive touchdown thrown in. 27 against Michigan, 28 against Oregon, a lot of yardage. So it's not automatic. People are looking at this game. I don't know what kind of feedback you're getting. It's obviously mostly from Notre Dame people, but it seems like the Notre Dame people on this channel just say, hey, we got a good shot. If we walk out with a 3-point loss, I'm not going to be crushed, but I'm kind of expecting to lose, but I'm not giving up on the game. We could win this game. The Ohio State fans seem to be a little ridiculous in their score predictions, like these 4 and 5 touchdown wins. And everybody in between that's got no dog in the fight seems to think Ohio State's 2 touchdowns better. And that's where Vegas has the game. So, yeah, it's not this Ohio State offense, for as insanely talented as it is, was not automatic last year. And if you got to go back to an elite defense post Justin Fields, they put up 49 when he was the quarterback in the playoff against Clemson. But this past season, not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think teams go through their ebbs and flows to an extent too. So I hate box score watching. And I'm not saying that that's what you're doing. I'm not even saying that's what other people are doing. But I think sometimes simply looking at what they put up, I think CJ Stroud obviously was in his first year as a starter as well, and it got much better as the season went on for them. I think there is something to be said that they lose 2 really talented wide receivers and a solid tight end. So you have guys that, even though they're talented wide receivers, and I mentioned obviously Jackson Smith-Njigba and Marvin Harrison Jr. And I know they have plenty of other guys, Julian Fleming's there, a bunch of 5-star pedigree players. Outside of Smith-Njigba, you don't have a lot of production there. So maybe, you have these kids that need to build chemistry with CJ Stroud, or, maybe they're not as good as their rankings were. You don't know how that's going to work out. But I tend to agree with a lot of the Notre Dame fans that think that there's a chance they can win, but most likely is a loss. I think it would be kind of naive to assume that Notre Dame is going to win that game, specifically because it's on the road against a really talented football program and probably against the best quarterback in the country. So, if Notre Dame were to win, would I be 100% surprised? No. But I'm not going to come on here and predict them to win, because I don't see that happening.
So when we take it past Ohio State, and we'll pop up the schedule here, what in particular stands out to you?
I mean, I think it really goes back to kind of what I said earlier. You have Ohio State, you have Clemson on the schedule at home, and you have USC. And I think obviously, USC has been down to an extent over the last few seasons, but you bring in Lincoln Riley, you get the transfers that they've gotten, the recruiting class that they sort of ended up with, and maybe it takes a year to sort of mesh and get that going, but overall, I mean, it's going to be a talent group. So, and then obviously I think BYU in Vegas, which is my hometown, is obviously something that I'm going to look at. And I think BYU is a talented program in their own right. And that's the Shamrock Series, which is always a fun time. So those are probably the 4 big games. They also play UNLV, which is ironic to me because that is my alma mater. And I'll probably find a way to get to that game if I can. Again, should be like a 70-0 blowout, but fun for me. And then they have the traditional, the other games that they play in the ACC that they've established over the last 7 to 10 years with that deal that they made where they play 4 to 6 programs on a yearly basis.
So obviously the complete difference between looking at this schedule versus anybody else in the country that matters. There's a couple other independents, but I don't think that there are a whole lot of live streams dedicated to New Mexico and UMass. When you look at this schedule, it's obviously completely built by Notre Dame. So in addition to analyzing it from the standpoint of, okay, these are the pitfalls, Ohio State, USC, Clemson, et cetera, and then these are some of the highlights for you. Just in terms of the approach to the schedule, the construction of the schedule, what are you good with this? Are you good with the approach?
Yeah, I think the only thing I don't like is I wish that there was maybe one less like non-Power 5 game on there.
Okay.
Playing Marshall, fine, playing UNLV, whatever. I'd like to maybe only play, and then obviously, of course, you have Navy on the schedule on a yearly basis. I don't think you need to play both Marshall and UNLV. Does that make their schedule weak? No, I don't think so. But that's probably the one thing I would look at because I think we're starting to see that sort of built into their schedule on a more regular basis. And the last couple of years where maybe some programs they played have been, somewhat down, then it does put a little bit of a damper on the schedule overall when, USC, Stanford, programs like that are not at their best. And then you have a UNLV and a Marshall on there. All of a sudden you have, maybe a weaker schedule than you would like, but it's certainly not weak in the way that some people say.
So Dave's got a comment here that I can line up with in terms of Notre Dame. The big transition in the schedule and the strength of the schedule has been this contract with the ACC. So displace Michigan State, Purdue, not that Purdue's typically a power, but replace those 3 and whomever else Notre Dame would have scheduled from, let's say, the SEC or somewhere else with these ACC games that, sure, Clemson's a rough out, of course, one of the best in the country. And then there might be a random game here and there. North Carolina a couple of years ago with Sam Howell, tough. Florida State, Miami have been down. The Louisvilles and Wake Forest of the world they're good teams, they're decent teams, but they're not top 10 caliber. They're more in that top 25 to 40 range. So when you look at the ACC component in this schedule, it's obviously brought down the schedule. This particular season, it's in addition to Clemson, BC, Syracuse, North Carolina on the road. So those are the other 4 in addition to the Clemson game.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of a point I was sort of getting at is I think when Notre Dame joined the ACC, they weren't expecting the ACC to all of a sudden be this, not forgotten conference, but it's kind of Clemson and everybody else. Unless you play Clemson on that schedule, the ACC has sort of been weak over the last several years. Florida State, who's been a powerhouse program for many years, is down. Miami, traditional powerhouse program, down. And then you have, Virginia Tech, who hasn't been as great over the last couple of years. Virginia has been sort of, up and down, whatever. I do actually want to get to the Willie comment because I completely disagree with that, and I saw that a few minutes ago. But yeah, no, I think that's a legitimate argument that the ACC has been somewhat weak, and I don't think Notre Dame was expecting that when they made this deal of having to play. It's usually 4 to 6 games. It was supposed to be 5, but with their schedule that they kind of had built in previously, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6. But getting to Willie's comment, I think first of all, Notre Dame does play a lot of the same teams on a yearly basis, first and foremost, especially traditionally. I mean, you go back before the ACC, they played Michigan every year. That's 1. They played at USC every year. 2, they played Michigan State. 3, Navy. 4, Stanford. 5. So that's already 5 games. And then you throw in a lot of the other programs that they played, maybe not every single season, but very, very consistently. You're playing pretty much the same teams every year. And then now that you throw the ACC in there, do they always play the same team every year? No, but they play a lot of the same teams every year. And then you still throw in USC, Stanford, Navy that they play on a yearly basis. If you want to say Navy's trash, that's fine. But Navy's probably just as good as a lot of the bottom feeders in the Big Ten and different things like that, at least on a consistent basis. But so maybe they don't play the exact however many teams that the Big Ten teams play on a yearly basis, and you don't maybe have that. Well, Mark, you probably have a better idea just because I don't follow conference scheduling as much as teams that are in a conference do. But I mean, how many actual teams is, like, for example, Michigan play yearly? I know even in the Big Ten they have separate sides. Sure. And play everybody every year.
Yeah, so you get the 14 teams split into 2 17 divisions, so you play everyone in your division. So there's 6 games there, and then you play 3 other conference games in the other division, and those rotate. Unless you're Indiana and Purdue that are scheduled by the conference to play every year because of a rivalry. That's the only matchup, division to division, that is set every year. The rest of it just rotates. So yeah, one of the fallacies, if I can text somebody back there, one of the fallacies that people bring up, and they'll say this, this comes up in SEC discussions all the time, and the Big Ten to a lesser degree, is that, if so-and-so joined the Big Ten, well, they got to play Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Iowa, Penn State. They run down the 7 or 8 best teams in the conference. And that's not the case. You're going to miss, you're playing 9 teams out of 14, or out of what would be the other 14. So you're going to play 2/3 of them, 2/3 of the best teams, most likely in a given year.
Yeah, I mean, those are kind of my thoughts on it, to be honest with you. It's just, I don't really understand it too much, especially because kind of what I just ran down, the fact that Notre Dame plays a lot of the same teams on a yearly basis anyway. And I think that there's actually something to be said, because I think and I think you would agree with me on this, Mark, the conference, or most conferences, have a very similar style of play. And when Notre Dame has to play, Pac-12, they play usually an SEC team every year, or every couple of years. Then you have your couple teams that you play on a yearly basis, a couple of the ACC teams. You throw a Big Ten team in there. There's all these different styles of play, and I think you could argue that's sort of tougher to prepare for. But even without that, I still think they play a lot of the same teams. If not yearly, then very regularly, and that's where I kind of come into this whole idea that it's, like you mentioned, I think fallacy is a really good word for it.
All right, folks, once again, this is our Notre Dame live stream to kick off fall camp, which happens here in the next week in South Bend. Marcus Freeman and company gearing up for Ohio State in week 1, and a tough schedule regardless of where you come from. You've got to admit, Notre Dame, maybe the schedules aren't top 5 in the nation anymore, but they're certainly top 25 or 30 in the nation, and they cannot be blamed for the likes of Florida State, Virginia Tech, USC, and others being down Stanford in the last 4 or 5 years. All right, join Nathan on his podcast, Golden Homers Podcast. They hope to produce their next episode coming up here in the next 3 or 4 days. And you can catch that on your favorite audio platform or just follow Nathan there on Twitter. Nathan, anything else before we sign off for the day?
No, I mean, not really. I know we didn't get too much into fall camp, but I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit here as things sort of progress over the next couple of weeks. But no, other than that, I mean, good talking as always. I'm glad to get back on, and hopefully I'll be on again here soon.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Appreciate you being here. Support the Voice of College Football. I've got all sorts of realignment and expansion videos that have been released here in the last few days, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Mark.